Competition between nations has been an integral part of the human story, which, although usually good-natured, can sometimes escalate into conflict that wreaks unimaginable destruction, as great empires become embroiled in life-or-death struggles. Yet, although the source of untold suffering, such rivalries often permanently change the world, as great advances rise from the ashes of conflict that push civilization forward at an unbelievable pace. Here are my choices for 5 destructive rivalries that changed the world. Number 5. Rome and Carthage. A century-long titanic struggle between 2 powerful ancient empires would unleash 3 devastating wars upon the world, dooming hundreds of thousands to an early and violent death, as Rome and Carthage fought to the bitter end in a clash that would determine the future course of Western civilization. What became known as the Punic Wars would be some of the largest conflicts that mankind had ever seen, as the established order of the world was shaken to its core. The vanquished slaughtered or taken as slaves, their cities wiped from the face of the earth, while the victors would go on to build an empire that would span much of the known world and influence nearly every aspect of modern life. Before the wars began, Carthage had flourished for over 600 years, becoming the preeminent power of the Western Mediterranean, thanks to its large navy and trading empire that spread from North Africa to Spain, Sardinia, and the island of Sicily. However, this was an area which was now on the doorstep of the Romans, a people who were themselves rapidly growing in strength, having conquered the Italian peninsula. Only Rome could come close to rivaling the power and wealth of Carthage, the 2 empires easily eclipsing all other tribes and kingdoms in the region. However, their earlier policy of peaceful coexistence was coming to an end as the 2 growing empires quickly found their spheres of influence colliding, with Sicily as the flashpoint. With a Carthaginian base so close to Rome's borders, it quickly became clear that the Mediterranean world was not big enough for 2 expanding great empires, yet both the Carthaginians and the Romans were convinced that the future belonged to them and them alone. The stage was set for an ancient war to end all wars, as each side fought a battle for survival from which only one empire could prevail. The First Punic War broke out in 264 BC, when Rome interfered in a local dispute taking place on Carthaginian-controlled Sicily. The side the Romans had backed was in direct opposition with the faction backed by Carthage, resulting in this small local conflict rapidly escalating into an ancient world war, as both sides called their allies into the fight. With the largest navy in the ancient world at its command, Carthage seemed to be in the dominant position. However, after suffering some early setbacks, the Romans stoically set to work on expanding their fleet, managing to muster over 100 warships in just 2 months. Ships which they put to deadly use, winning a string of stunning victories which finally broke the Carthaginians' naval superiority and forced them to sue for peace. The shocked Carthaginians now found themselves kicked out of Sicily and burdened with war reparations which would see them greatly weakened and destabilized. Rome had announced its emergence as both a land and naval power to the world. However, their hated rivals were beaten but not broken. The long fight had only just begun. Desperate for a new source of wealth to replace their losses, Carthage began expanding into modern-day Spain, which was rich in silver. However, this expansion would once again bring them into conflict with Rome when the Carthaginian army attacked a Roman-protected town. The Second Punic War erupted in 218 BC, as once again the 2 great empires vied for dominance, the conflict becoming most noted for the actions of the legendary Carthaginian general, Hannibal Barca, who undertook the seemingly impossible task of marching a 100,000-man army, including 37 war elephants, across the treacherous Alps, allowing him to take the Romans by surprise and invade their Italian heartland from the north, even threatening the great city of Rome herself. Over 17 years of bloody fighting, 600,000 men would perish, as Hannibal nearly brought Rome to her knees, winning a string of brilliant victories in battle, culminating in his legendary annihilation of an entire Roman army at Cannae in 216 BC, where he used tactics still taught to this day to surround and wipe out a Roman force twice his size, slaughtering 70,000 Romans on a single day. Yet despite winning battle after battle, Hannibal failed to land the killing blow and capture Rome, having lost his siege engines and most of his elephants in the ice and snow of the Alps. Unable to convince Rome's Italian allies to join him, he was left to roam the countryside while the Romans waited in their walled cities and rebuilt their strength, eventually retaking the initiative by launching a surprise attack on North Africa, forcing Hannibal to abandon his invasion of Italy and return home, where he was soundly beaten by General Scipio at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Against all the odds, the Roman Republic had prevailed, surviving a series of cataclysmic defeats and an invasion that saw them on the brink of destruction. Rome now controlled Spain, leaving Carthage confined to North Africa, the once mighty empire humiliated and reduced to controlling little more than the city of Carthage itself. The great Carthaginian threat had now been all but completely smashed. However, the Romans were not a people prone to forgive and forget, and hatred of the old enemy remained at all levels of Roman society. When Carthage later went to war with their Numidian neighbours, Rome claimed that the peace treaty had been violated, as Carthage was supposed to request Roman approval before launching any of its own wars. In order to justify the third and final Punic War, the Romans made the impossible demand that the Carthaginian people should destroy their city and relocate 10 miles inland away from the coast, or be attacked, a demand which was of course rejected. A Roman army was dispatched to lay siege to the city, and after a 3-year-long struggle during which as many as 350,000 citizens perished, the mighty walls were finally breached. The vengeful Roman army swarmed inside, slaughtering, burning and looting their way through a city which had stood for over 700 years and birthed one of the great civilizations of the world, unleashing a level of destruction so complete that it said that even the Roman commander openly wept at the devastation his men had wrought, overwhelmed by the stark realization that all great empires and cities are doomed to fall, and that one day a similar bleak fate would await his beloved Rome. Over the course of 17 days, Carthage was reduced to ash and rubble, its 50,000 remaining citizens sold into slavery, the territories they had once controlled now incorporated into the Roman Empire as the province of Africa. A bitter rivalry which stretched over 100 years and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives had left Rome as the supreme power in the Western Mediterranean, this life and death struggle bringing the young empire to the brink of defeat, but in doing so forcing the Roman people to adapt to survive. The struggles they experienced during the Punic Wars, forging one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen, an army which would go on to dominate Europe and much of the known world, leaving a legacy which has shaped modern Western civilization. Number 4. England and France. While most rivalries between nations are measured in decades or even centuries, the rivalry between the people of England and France has stretched across a millennia, involving dozens of wars fought upon hundreds of battlefields across the globe at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, as each nation vied for the domination of Europe and the wider world. The conflicts fought between the two countries have roughly equal population, resources and power, affecting every corner of the planet and shaping the world we live in today. The seeds of the rivalry stretch back to 1066, when the Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, crossed the English Channel with an army some 14,000 strong to forcibly press his claim to the English throne, defeating King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings and imposing a new French-dominated nobility that would lead to an intertwining of the two nations, as William's successors would fight to press their own claims on French territory, resulting in centuries of war, bloodshed and animosity. Just 300 years later, this messy conflict of claims and counterclaims would explode into a century-long struggle which later became known as the 100 Years' War, which was in fact a series of wars between the rulers of England and the rulers of France over which side's claim to the disputed French throne was legitimate. As the two rival dynasties fought across 5 generations, the English side won several famous victories, such as those at Crécy and Agincourt. However, the tide of battle soon turned, resulting in the English losing most of its major land holdings in France. Yet even after such a lengthy and costly conflict, the rivalry between the two countries had only just begun, with the war establishing a greater sense of nationalism amongst both sides, a nationalism that would see both powers continuing to clash, as their interests conflicted during the age of colonialism, with each side interfering in the other's wars in an effort to undermine the enemy's power. With the discovery of the Americas, ambitious men from across Europe looked west for opportunities for advancement and enrichment. However, this new world would also provide new battlegrounds for the continuation of old conflicts, as the French and British fought each other over colonial possessions, making treaties with Native Americans in an effort to secure the continent for themselves, while denying the enemy access to new and wealthy territory in which to expand. This new American setting for the French and British rivalry perhaps saw its most world-changing event occur with the American Revolution, when settlers of the 13 colonies who had grown dissatisfied with British rule revolted against the Crown in 1775. Sensing an opportunity to undermine the British, France intervened on the side of the American rebels, initially sending supplies and intelligence before eventually dispatching troops to fight alongside the Americans. Faced with this French threat closer to home, Britain was unable to commit the number of troops it might have otherwise sent to fight the rebellion had France not been involved, and those troops who were deployed in America now had to fight two enemies. In fact, it's highly likely that this intervention by France may have swung the balance of power in the favour of the rebels and resulted in the establishment of the USA, a nation which would go on to become the world's sole superpower and itself drastically change the planet, the butterfly effect of this one event alone transforming the course of human history. Yet French intervention had come at great cost, the war leaving France racked by debts, which caused a financial crisis which may have directly led to the French Revolution of 1789, in which the monarchy was overthrown and the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and plunged the entire continent into war, chaos which was initially welcomed by the British, who no doubt revelled in the sight of their old enemy being torn apart by civil strife. However, Napoleon's rise would soon threaten Britain's very existence, as his seemingly invincible armies rapidly conquered much of Europe, turning France into a military superpower. Over 21 years of war, Britain and France once again vied for supremacy on battlefields across the world, propelling the ancient rivalry to even greater heights until a coalition of allies finally put down the threat from Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo, in a contest that the British commander later described as the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Yet with the world rapidly changing and faced with growing threats from other emerging powers, these two old enemies would soon find themselves thrown together in a fight for their mutual survival, allying against the expanding Russian Empire in the Crimean War, and most famously against the Germans in 2 world wars. With the dawn of the 21st century, it seems as though this rivalry has finally been put to rest. However, the unending competition between the two countries over the previous 1,000 years has left a permanent mark on our world, the war and threat of war forcing each side to strive for even greater feats in order to best the other, perhaps enabling both nations to carve out massive global empires, which, for better or worse, have touched every corner of the planet in some way. Number 3. Ancient Greece and the Persian Empire. The destructive rivalry between the ancient Greeks and Persians would birth some of history's most legendary battles and fabled heroes as East and West collided along the boundary between Europe and Asia to determine the future course of mankind. This desperate fight for survival and dominance causing an exchange of cultures, knowledge, and ideas, whose legacy is still visible today, a legacy forged in the fire of wars that would see great empires rise and fall as hundreds of thousands of men fought and perished, carrying out the wishes of kings and emperors whose names have become almost mythical. By 500 BC, the Persian Empire had become a juggernaut whose borders spread from modern-day Turkey in the west as far as India in the east, encapsulating much of the known world and making it the undisputed superpower of the age, able to summon enormous armies from the territories of the dozens of nations it had previously conquered and absorbed. Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, the Greeks were a divided people living in a backwater part of the world, spread amongst fiercely independent, competing city-states who were frequently at war with one another, as each city fought and plotted to increase its own influence and power. Yet the rapid expansion of the Persians would mean that it was only a matter of time until Greece and the rest of Europe would suffer the same fate as the conquered nations of the East and face demands to submit to the Persian emperor or be destroyed. The eruption of a centuries-long rivalry occurred in 500 BC, when Greeks who had settled along the Anatolian coast and had been conquered by the Persians rose up in rebellion against their overlords. The Athenians, one of Greece's most powerful city-states, had lent the rebels military support. However, when the rebellion was crushed after 6 years of bloody fighting, the Persian king Darius did not forget this Athenian meddling in the internal affairs of his empire, swearing to punish Athens for their insolence and preparing an invasion of the Greek mainland. Persian envoys were dispatched to the Greek city-states to demand their submission, with Darius confident that he could pick them off one by one. However, Athens and Sparta, two of the most powerful of the city-states, refused to surrender and vowed to temporarily put their differences aside to form an alliance in the hope that others would join them. Such defiance must have seemed hopeless, with a massive 46-nation Persian army descending upon Greek shores, this fragile alliance the only thing standing between them and total Persian domination of Greece and all of Europe. Nothing short of a miracle would be needed if the invaders were to be beaten. Yet such a miracle was granted at the famous Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, when a Persian army of between 25,000 and 100,000 men was soundly beaten by 10,000 Greeks, with just 192 Greek losses for a staggering 6,400 Persians. The invading army taught a vicious lesson in the superiority of the Greek heavy infantry, hoplites who were well defended from the Persian arrows in the heavy bronze armour, the tightly packed phalanx making quick work of the lightly armoured foes. This incredible victory showed the other Greek city-states that the Persians were far from invincible, encouraging many to raise arms against the invaders, resulting in a far wider alliance being formed. Yet this defeat did not dissuade the Persians from their goal, and the invasion continued, resulting in several other now legendary battles being fought, including Thermopylae, where somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million Persian soldiers were held off for 3 days by a small band of perhaps 7,000 Greeks in a narrow pass that would become a charnel house, before a Greek traitor showed the Persian army a secret mountain path that led behind Greek lines, resulting in the Spartan king Leonidas fighting to the death in a rearguard action. The heroism of this last stand further rallying together the disunited Greek city-states. At Salamis, the Persian navy was finally defeated by the Greeks, and at Plataea, the Persian army was driven from the country, after a combined force of Greeks came together to inflict a humiliating defeat on the enemy, which ancient sources say resulted in the Persians losing between 300,000 and 500,000 men. Yet the defeat of this invasion was far from the end of the rivalry. Like all vendettas and feuds, the cycle is hard to break, as each side becomes obsessed with avenging perceived wrongdoings visited upon them by the enemy, and the Greeks themselves would now go on the offensive, most notably with the conquests of Alexander the Great, who rallied his men with promises of revenge and potential for great riches, winning a string of victories that would lead to the death of the last Persian emperor and the destruction of the empire itself. In doing so, creating a new Greek-led empire that stretched from Anatolia to northwestern India, his Greek colonists spreading a new civilization across the world which closed the gap between East and West and drastically altered the future, before the empire finally fell apart upon Alexander's death, giving birth to a myriad of new nations led by his once loyal generals. This collision of cultures on the fault line of East and West created an exchange of ideas that would bloom into what we now understand as Western civilization. The wars fought between the two sides having the unintended consequence of each side adopting the best features of the other, with victory catapulting the Greeks into a period of incredible development which would lay the foundations for the modern world we live in today. Number 2. The Ottomans and the Habsburgs. Like the Greeks and Persians millennia before them, the Habsburgs and the Ottomans would become embroiled in a clash of civilizations that would span over 300 years along the blood-soaked border between East and West, fighting wars that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, during which some of history's most monumental battles were fought, as each side struggled to assert dominance over the other. Yet despite in many ways being polar opposites, the two enemies would find themselves victims of similar circumstances, their fates intertwined as the rapidly changing world moved on without them, eventually leading to their mutual decline and eventual destruction during the Great War, a conflict in which the two age-old enemies found themselves thrown together as allies in a doomed fight for survival against the great powers of the modern world. The Ottoman Turks had been advancing west since the 14th century, eventually overwhelming the last bastion of the ancient Roman Empire by seizing the fabled city of Constantinople in 1453. By the 16th century, they owned much of the Balkans, controlled the Black Sea, and doubled their empire's territory by conquering Syria and Egypt. The exploits of talented and renowned sultans had made the Ottomans the undisputed leaders of the Muslim world, wielding the largest army in Europe to sweep aside any and all opposition, the rising superpower striking fear into the hearts of leaders across Christian Europe, to whom the Ottomans appeared as an unstoppable juggernaut as kingdom after kingdom fell before them. At the same time as the Ottomans were expanding their empire in the east, so too were the House of Habsburg in the west, not at the point of a sword, but by marriage and diplomatic maneuvering. This Austrian family had won control over great swathes of Germany and Central Europe through strategic marriages to heiresses. This shrewd marriage policy went on to gain the Habsburgs control over areas of France and the Low Countries, Luxembourg, Brittany, and even Spain and the south of Italy, leaving Charles V as the Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of some of Europe's most rich and powerful kingdoms. Yet these rapid acquisitions of land would also lead to disaster. After the King of Hungary was killed in battle in 1526, the Habsburgs found themselves in control of this shattered kingdom, which was in the process of being swallowed up by the Ottomans. The House of Habsburg was now on the front line against the Ottoman advance, having not only inherited Hungarian land, but also the burden of dealing with the seemingly invincible Ottoman armies marching on the heart of Europe. The stage was now set for centuries of conflict, during which the Habsburgs would be forced to bear the brunt of the Ottoman drive westwards, this powerful dynasty acting as Europe's last line of defence. Over the course of 3 centuries, a series of battles and wars would be fought, their names among Europe's most legendary and influential events, as the Ottomans tried to push further and further west, while the Habsburgs desperately tried to throw them back. On 2 occasions, the Ottoman armies even reached as far as the gates of Vienna, one of Europe's great capital cities, only to be saved at the last minute by a combined force of Polish and German forces under the legendary Polish king Jan Sobieski, the event still remembered to this day as one which single-handedly saved the entire continent from Ottoman domination. Yet unlike most historical rivalries, this clash would have no clear victor, and both empires would find themselves left behind as the world moved on without them. Throughout the 19th century, a terminal decline began for both sides as new powers began to emerge, the French, British, Germans and Russians, undergoing rapid industrialization that enabled them to field larger and more advanced armies which were used to conquer global empires that gave them access to near unlimited raw materials. Both the Ottomans and the Austrian empires lacked this heavy industry, and the 2 arch-enemies now found their interests beginning to align for the first time, as a far deadlier enemy was growing in strength in the east, the Russian bear hungrily eyeing up the territory of these 2 waning powers, a threat which would eventually lead to both sides becoming allies in the Great War, a conflict which would see their empires dissolved. Yet despite both sides now being just a page in history, the legacy of their rivalry would reform the world, with hundreds of years of war contributing towards a European military revolution as the Christian powers were forced to develop and adapt to the existential threat the Ottomans provided, in doing so jumping ahead of their eastern rivals and constructing modern military machines that would go on to influence and dominate the planet. Number 1. The Soviet Union and USA. A 4-decade-long struggle between 2 superpowers would leave millions dead and cost countless billions of dollars, resulting in much of the world being divided into 2 fiercely opposed camps, as each side tried to surpass the other in power, influence and achievement, in an effort to prove that their system and way of living were superior. Yet unlike the other collisions between nations and empires throughout history, the stakes of this particular rivalry were the very existence of the human race itself, with the clash between communism and capitalism threatening to escalate into a global nuclear war that had the potential to destroy all life on Earth. The seeds of this precarious balance of power were planted during the Second World War, where despite fighting as allies against the Axis powers, the relationship was in reality merely one of convenience, as both sides had a mutual enemy in Nazi Germany. Yet with the destruction of the German threat in 1945, Europe itself was left torn in 2, as the USA and her allies held sway in the West, while much of Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, resulting in the installation of communist governments that were little more than puppets of Stalin. Distrust reigned ahead of reason, as Americans grew concerned that the USSR held unshakable ambitions to spread communism further in an effort to take over the rest of the world, while on the other side the Soviets were convinced that their very survival as a sovereign nation was at stake, in a world where they were surrounded by hostile capitalists, a fear further soured by America's previous refusal to recognize the USSR following the Russian Revolution, coupled with their delay in opening a second front against Germany during the war, a delay which was seen as having cost the lives of millions more Soviet citizens than was necessary. Some voices in the American military even called for the army to continue heading east after the defeat of Germany, with the goal of destroying this perceived communist threat once and for all. However, cooler heads prevailed, and a policy of containment won the day, the idea being to build up the United States' military capabilities and use this immense force to contain communist expansionism wherever it reared its head in the world. Yet with the development of atomic weapons, both sides rapidly gained control of arsenals containing thousands of nuclear missiles, which had the power to bring about the mutually assured destruction of both nations as well as the rest of the world. And so with the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over both countries, it became clear that a conventional war would have no winners. A Cold War descended upon the world, one which would be waged on political, economic, and cultural battlefields, as well as through proxy wars fought indirectly between the two superpowers, as a titanic struggle was played out on the international stage to decide which faction would dominate. Both sides sought every opportunity possible to expand their influence with other unaligned countries, while simultaneously undermining the efforts of their rivals, recruiting new allies to their cause through the use of financial and military aid provided to communist or anti-communist governments and revolutionaries across every corner of the planet. New governments rose and fell the world over, as both nations used espionage, bribery, intimidation, and outright war to remove any leader deemed to be going over to the other side, resulting in terrible proxy wars that would cost millions of lives. In Korea and Vietnam, the United States intervened in an attempt to prevent a communist takeover, their enemies using weapons and aid provided by the Soviet Union, while in Afghanistan, it would be the Soviets' turn to become embroiled in a war with guerrillas who were receiving the backing of their rivals. Such widespread confrontation on and off the battlefield took place on a scale never seen before, the clash nearly escalating into an all-out nuclear war on several occasions, most notably during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the Soviets installed missile bases across Cuba, which were capable of launching attacks on US cities. For 40 years the world lived with the prospect of Armageddon occurring on a moment's notice, and nuclear attack drills, warning sirens, and fallout bunkers became a part of everyday life, with even school children being taught to duck and cover in the event of an attack. Each new day brought the potential for a new conflict, which might spiral out of control, the massive stockpiles of weapons developed by each side growing more deadly as billions were spent each year funding research and development into ever more efficient ways of wreaking destruction. Yet such developments did not only have military uses, and this massive investment into defense would spill over and affect every facet of civilian life, the new advancements being used in a myriad of ways to improve efficiency, wealth, and comfort, catapulting technology and the very idea of what is achievable by man to unbelievable heights, with some of the greatest strides being made in the heavens, as a space race gripped the world, with both the USA and Soviet Union dedicating vast resources towards space exploration in an effort to unlock further military advantages over their rival, directly leading to the creation of NASA and the Apollo 11 mission of 1969, when the first man set foot upon the moon. Yet such heavy expenditures would take its toll, and the Soviet Union began experiencing severe economic strife, coupled with internal political unrest, as it struggled to maintain the immense military spending required to keep up with the United States, leading to its eventual disintegration in 1991, and the ending of the Cold War as the world moved into a new and supposedly more peaceful era. Yet just a cursory glance at news headlines today reveals that this rivalry is in fact far from over. The world forged from this 40-year-long standoff, one that still presents multiple threats to peace. So those are my choices for 5 destructive rivalries that changed the world. Let me know your thoughts and which others you would have included in the comments below, and I'll see you again soon.